The roadside bar stood on the edge of a small town, the kind of place where truck drivers stopped for a quick drink, where old friends met after long weeks, and where the sound of laughter mixed with the clink of glasses. On this particular night, the atmosphere was warm and easy. A jukebox in the corner played an old song, its tune soft against the hum of conversation. People gathered at tables, some leaning over pool games, others talking about work and family. It was a simple evening, ordinary in every sense, until the door opened. A sudden hush followed the sound of heavy boots striking the wooden floor. The air seemed to thicken as a group of men walked in, their presence loud without needing to speak. They were bikers, leather jackets, steel chains, and the unmistakable swagger of men used to taking up space. Their laughter was rough, their voices carried arrogance, and their eyes scanned the room like predators searching for prey. Most of the patrons lowered their gazes, hoping to avoid notice. At the counter sat a woman, quietly sipping her drink. She was young, dressed simply, and seemed lost in her own thoughts. Her presence did not demand attention, but something about her calm composure stood apart from the nervous energy that now filled the room. She was a black woman, strong in posture though alone, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. The leader of the bikers, a broad man with a shaved head and arms that looked carved from stone, noticed her. His smirk widened as he made his way to the counter. The room watched, tension rising, yet no one dared to intervene. The man planted himself in front of her, blocking her view of the bar. "What's a pretty thing like you doing here all by yourself?" he asked, his tone playful but sharp enough to cut. She looked at him, steady and unflinching. "I am here to have a drink like everyone else." Her calmness did not amuse him. In fact, it seemed to bother him. His pride demanded more, demanded control. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You think you can brush me off? You know who I am?" The woman did not answer. She reached for her glass instead, taking a quiet sip. The silence was a challenge, and it lit a fire in his eyes. Without warning, he reached forward and grabbed her by the collar. With one harsh pull, he tore her shirt, the sound of ripping fabric slicing through the room. A gasp echoed across the bar. The crowd froze. The jukebox played on, the cheerful tune now painfully out of place. The woman staggered back against the counter, her drink spilling, yet her expression did not break into panic. She looked straight at him, her jaw tight, her breath controlled. The biker grinned, proud of his display of power. "You want to sit here like you own the place? Let me remind you, nobody says no to me. You pay or things get broken. Do you hear me?" His words boomed, carrying into every corner. The patrons felt the threat as if it were aimed at them too. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Fear anchored them to their seats. Some lowered their eyes further, while others stared at the woman, waiting to see what she would do. For the first time, her torn shirt revealed more than just fabric. It revealed something etched on her skin. On her shoulder in bold ink was a tattoo. Not just any tattoo, but the emblem of the United States Marine Corps. The eagle, globe and anchor gleamed under the dim lights, a mark that spoke louder than his threats. The biker's grip tightened, but his smirk wavered. His eyes flicked down to the tattoo, then back up at her face. For the first time that night, he saw something he could not bend with force. The bar had fallen into silence so deep it was almost deafening. Every person stared, first at the tattoo, then at the woman's unbroken stance. Whispers stirred in the back, recognition, respect, surprise. She finally spoke, her voice low but firm. "You think fear makes you strong, but strength is not in fear. Strength is in control, in discipline, in respect. You would not understand that." Her words cut sharper than his threats. The room shifted as if the power had quietly moved from his hands to hers. The biker did not respond. His pride wrestled with the sight before him, but for the first time he was not sure of his footing. Behind him, his gang watched, waiting to see how their leader would react. Around the room, strangers felt something rise within them, something long buried under their own hesitations. The moment was not yet a victory. The threat was still there, but the first crack had appeared in his mask of dominance, and in that crack, the woman's courage shone like a light, reaching everyone who had been afraid to lift their heads. The night was no longer ordinary. The clash had begun, and it was not just between a biker and a woman. It was between fear and dignity, between arrogance and honor. The bar had become a stage, and every heart inside it knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. The silence inside the bar pressed down like a heavy weight. The jukebox had finished its song, and even the machine seemed hesitant to play the next track. All eyes were fixed on the tense standoff at the counter, where the biker's hand still gripped the torn fabric of the woman's shirt. His gang stood behind him like shadows, their presence adding to the danger that everyone felt in the air. Yet what unsettled him most was not the fear of those watching, but the calm defiance radiating from the woman in his grasp. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers, his breath hot with anger. "Do you think that tattoo makes you untouchable?" he growled. "You can flash all the symbols you want, but in here I make the rules. You either hand over cash, or I make sure everyone in this place learns what happens when someone disrespects me." His words were not just aimed at her, they were for the entire room, a show of dominance, a reminder that he thrived on fear. But as his threat spilled out, the woman did not shrink back. She stood tall despite the torn shirt, her steady eyes fixed on his. Around them, people who had frozen in fear began to notice the difference between the biker's aggression and her composure. He was loud, messy, unstable. She was silent, controlled, unshaken. The contrast made his anger seem smaller with every passing second. The biker's men shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other, unsure whether their leader's words still held the same weight they once did. They had seen him intimidate plenty before, but something about this moment was different. The Marine Corps tattoo was not just ink. It was a reminder of a life he could not begin to understand. That mark meant battles fought with honor, discipline carved into the soul, and strength that did not need to shout. The woman finally spoke, her voice calm but sharp enough to pierce the silence. "You want to make an example out of me? Go ahead. But understand this. I have already stood in places you would never survive. I have faced storms that would tear you apart. You think you can frighten me with threats? Fear is a weapon I learned to master long ago." Her words hung in the air, powerful and steady. The crowd stirred, and for the first time, heads lifted. Some who had been afraid to meet the biker's gaze now looked at him directly, encouraged by her defiance. It was as if her courage had spread like a spark in dry grass, igniting something in everyone who heard her. The biker tightened his jaw. His grip on her shirt faltered for a moment before he forced himself to hold it firm again. But even he felt it, the shift in the air, the quiet slipping of control from his hands. He slammed his fist against the counter, making glasses rattle, trying to reclaim authority through force. "You think you're better than me? You think your stories of service matter here? This is my world, not yours." But the bar no longer seemed convinced. Even those who had always stayed quiet in moments like this, who had always chosen safety over confrontation, were beginning to sense that something was different tonight. A whisper traveled through the crowd, words of recognition, respect. Someone quietly murmured, "Marine," and the word carried weight. The woman did not flinch at the sound of his fist against the counter. Instead, she took a breath, steady and unbroken, and replied, "You mistake noise for power. But real power is in silence. Real power is in control. You have no control, and everyone here sees it." The room felt her words as much as they heard them. They carried the truth that the biker had spent years covering up with volume and intimidation. He could frighten, he could threaten, but he could not command respect. Respect belonged to those who had earned it, those who had sacrificed, those who stood for something greater than themselves. The biker's bravado cracked, though he tried to hide it behind another sneer. He looked around the room, expecting to find support in the eyes of his gang, but even they seemed uneasy now. The silence from his own men spoke louder than any cheer. For the first time, the man who thrived on being untouchable felt the weight of isolation. The woman shifted slightly, breaking free from his grip. She stood tall, adjusting the torn fabric of her shirt without rushing, as if the moment had belonged to her all along. Her voice remained calm. "You should let go now. This is not the fight you think it is. You may control with fear for a time, but fear does not last. It crumbles the moment courage stands up." The words landed in the center of the bar like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every heart present. Courage. That was what they had been missing. That was what she had just given them. The biker stepped back, only slightly, but enough for the crowd to notice. His pride kept him from retreating entirely, but the shift in his body spoke volumes. He muttered something under his breath, a half-formed threat that no longer carried the same sting. The balance of the room had changed, and everyone knew it. The woman turned her gaze to the people around her. Not pleading, not demanding, just steady and clear. Fear only wins if we let it. You do not need to bow to it. Not tonight. For the first time, people began to stir from their seats. A man near the back stood, not aggressively, but with quiet purpose. An older woman beside him set down her glass firmly, her chin raised. One by one, others straightened in their chairs, their silence no longer rooted in fear but in growing resolve. The biker felt it, the ground slipping beneath him, the audience he had once controlled slipping out of his grasp. The tension in the room had transformed. What had begun as a threat now carried the weight of awakening. The woman's words had turned the bar into something more than a place of drink and chatter. It had become a place where dignity rose against intimidation, where courage silenced noise, where one voice inspired many. The biker, though still standing tall, was no longer the center of the story. His threats had lost their edge, stripped of the fear that gave them power. The room had seen the truth. Strength was not in tearing others down, but in standing unbroken. And in that truth, the night was only just beginning to change. The bar had grown heavier with silence. Not the silence of fear anymore, but of anticipation, as if every single person inside was waiting for the next second to decide which way the night would turn. The biker still stood at the counter, his chest heaving as he tried to hold on to the scraps of power he had left. His men watched him with shifting eyes, uncertain whether to back him or distance themselves from the unease that was settling in. The woman before him, her shirt torn by his own hands, did not waver. She was not cowering, not shrinking, but standing straighter than before. And then the light caught it. The torn fabric had slipped enough to reveal her shoulder more clearly, and what had been glimpsed in flashes now showed itself fully. The eagle, globe and anchor of the United States Marine Corps tattoo. The ink was dark, precise and proud. In the dim glow of the bar's overhead lamps, it was more than just a mark on skin. It was a statement carved into her very being, a declaration of where she had been and who she had become. The emblem seemed to hold its own gravity, pulling the attention of every eye in the room. For a long moment, even the biker himself stopped. His hand, still holding her collar, trembled slightly. He had seen many tattoos in his life, skulls, flames, daggers, but this one was different. It did not speak of rebellion or danger for the sake of it. It spoke of discipline, sacrifice, and battles fought in silence when no one was watching. It spoke of something greater than the individual. He tried to mask his hesitation with another sneer, but those watching had already caught it. That flicker in his eyes that betrayed his uncertainty. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone near the back whispered, "Marine," and the word traveled like a wave, spreading from one table to the next. Veterans in the bar straightened in their seats. Men and women who recognized instantly what that tattoo represented. It was not simply ink, it was honor. It was the story of grueling days under burning sun, of nights when exhaustion and fear could not break a spirit, of choosing to serve and protect when it would have been easier to walk away. The woman did not need to explain the tattoo. She let it speak for itself. She looked into the biker's eyes unshaken, her voice steady and calm as she finally said, "You see this? This is not for decoration. This was earned. Every line of it was written in sacrifice. It is a reminder of who I am and what I carry, and it is a reminder that I will never bow to a man who tries to take by force what he cannot earn by respect." Her words rang out clearly, filling the space that had once been dominated by his threats. The crowd leaned in, hanging on every syllable. Even those who had never served, who knew little of the Marines beyond what they had seen on television, felt the weight of her words. They felt the authority of someone who had lived through things far harsher than a roadside bar confrontation. The biker opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out at first. The tattoo had cut deeper than her words. It was something he could not fight with fists or with noise. He finally forced a laugh, hollow and strained. "So what? You think some old ink makes you stronger than me? This is just a bar. Nobody cares about your past." But the way the crowd responded told him otherwise. Heads nodded in quiet respect. Eyes sharpened with something more than fear, they carried admiration. The woman had not just stood for herself. She had given the room permission to feel courage, to remember that strength could exist without cruelty. The biker's words, once so commanding, now sounded empty against the backdrop of her presence. The woman stepped forward, closing the space he had once used to tower over her. She was smaller than him, but in that moment her presence filled the room more than his size ever could. Strength is not about how loud you can shout or how much fear you can spread, she said. Strength is about what you can endure, what you can stand for, and who you can protect. That tattoo is not just mine. It belongs to everyone I stood beside and everyone I stood up for. You will not take that away, not here, not tonight. The bar seemed to breathe with her words. People shifted in their seats, the earlier paralysis replaced by an energy that had been missing for too long. A middle-aged man at the back raised his chin, his eyes glistening as he whispered, "Semper Fi," under his breath, and others caught the phrase and echoed it softly. The Latin motto of the Marines, "Always faithful," spread through the crowd like a promise, fragile yet powerful. The biker turned, hearing the murmurs, seeing the faces around him change. His men, who had once stood tall behind him, now looked away, their confidence shaken. He tried to regain control, pounding the counter again and shouting, "Everyone just sit down. She's nothing. Just a woman with a tattoo." But even as he said it, his voice cracked with desperation. The crowd did not sit. The silence that followed was not obedience, it was resistance. Every person staring back at him was no longer afraid in the way they had been moments earlier. The tattoo had awakened something they did not even realize they were holding inside. The woman had given them a reminder that fear could be broken when dignity stood unshaken. The biker stepped back, his bravado dimming as he realized he was losing the one thing he relied on most: control of the crowd. His threats carried no weight when people no longer believed in them. His strength seemed brittle against the quiet power of the woman standing before him. He clenched his fists, looking at her, then at the tattoo again. And for the first time since he entered the bar, he had no answer. The woman adjusted her torn shirt, not with shame but with pride, letting the tattoo remain visible. She did not gloat, did not raise her voice, but simply said, "I do not need to fight you to win. You already lost when you thought tearing fabric could break me." The words cut deeper than any weapon. The bar felt it. The crowd knew it. And the biker, though he stood with fists ready, understood it too. The tattoo had spoken, and in doing so it had changed everything. The night was far from over, but in that single revelation the balance of power had shifted. The woman was no longer just someone he tried to humiliate. She was the symbol of resilience that froze the whole bar, a reminder of courage, honor, and faithfulness that no act of aggression could erase. And as the room held its breath, waiting for what would come next, one truth had already settled deep in every heart present. Sometimes it is not fists or fury that stop a man in his tracks, but the quiet, undeniable weight of what someone has endured, and the story carried in the ink of a tattoo that speaks louder than words. The biker's chest rose and fell heavily as he stood there in the silence he no longer controlled. Just minutes before, he had owned the room with the force of his presence. His voice had been the loudest, his threats the sharpest, and fear had bent the crowd to his will. But now, something intangible had slipped away from him, something he had never truly understood. The woman's Marine Corps tattoo had stolen it from him without her lifting a single fist. It had replaced fear with something stronger, respect. And respect was something he could never demand, no matter how hard he tried. The crowd could feel it too. Men and women who had frozen in their seats, afraid to make eye contact, were now watching him without lowering their eyes. That alone was a blow to the power he thought he held. A man like him thrived on silence, but it had to be the silence of surrender. Now the silence in the bar felt different. It was not the hush of submission, but the quiet before resistance. The woman shifted slightly, her shoulders squared, her breath calm as if she were preparing for nothing more than a simple conversation. Her gaze locked on his, steady and unwavering. She did not shout. She did not threaten, and yet every word she spoke cut deeper than his growls. "You came here to prove you could control a room with anger. You thought breaking fabric would break me, but what you broke was the illusion that people needed to bow to you. They see you now not as powerful but as small." The biker's face twisted, but he could not find words quick enough to silence her. His fists clenched, veins visible in his arms, but violence no longer seemed like the answer. Not because he lacked the strength, but because he had lost the crowd. If he struck now, it would not cement his control. It would expose his weakness. His men sensed it too. They shuffled behind him, no longer standing tall with the same cocky bravado. Their loyalty had always been rooted in the dominance he projected, but the tattoo had cracked that projection wide open. Loyalty built on fear was fragile, and now they felt it crumbling. Some avoided his eyes. Others looked at the woman with something close to admiration, and one even seemed to consider stepping away altogether. The bar itself seemed to lean toward her now. An older man near the corner straightened in his chair, the faded outline of his own military tattoo barely visible beneath his sleeve. He gave her a nod, small but meaningful. Another man at the pool table shifted his weight, his hands resting firmly on the cue as if silently declaring he was no longer a bystander. The woman had not asked for their support, but her presence had awakened it. She spoke again, her words calm but carrying like a steady drumbeat. You built your strength on fear. I built mine on service. Fear fades the moment someone dares to stand against it. Service lasts forever. Discipline lasts forever. Honor lasts forever. That is why you are losing, even if you do not see it yet. The crowd stirred, heads nodding, shoulders squaring. Even those who had never served in the military could feel the truth in her words. Everyone had faced bullies in their lives, people who thrived on intimidation, and they all knew the hollow power fear carried. What they saw now was proof that fear could be broken, not by shouting louder but by standing still, unshaken. The biker's attempt to regain control came in the form of laughter, but it was laughter that rang empty, forced through clenched teeth. He spread his arms wide, addressing the room. You all think she's some kind of hero because of a tattoo? Don't forget where you are. This is a bar in the middle of nowhere. Heroes don't exist here. Only people like me decide what happens. But even as he spoke, he could feel the lie of his own words. Nobody believed him anymore. The eyes that once looked away now stared directly into his, stripping him of the invisible crown he had worn so easily before. The woman did not need to reply this time. The silence of the bar spoke for her. The power had shifted and everyone could see it. The woman, sensing the moment, stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She was calm, her movements deliberate. She adjusted her torn shirt, but she did not cover the tattoo. She let it remain visible, glowing like a quiet flame in the dim light. Her voice lowered, but it carried across the room. You thought strength was about taking. Real strength is about giving. I gave my time, my sweat, my pain so others could be safe. That is why this tattoo matters. Not because it makes me better than you, but because it reminds me that there is nothing you can do to frighten me. The biker flinched at her words, though he tried to hide it. His eyes darted around the room again, looking for the silent approval he once counted on. But all he saw was defiance reflected back at him. The men at the bar were no longer cowed. The women were no longer shrinking. Even the bartender, who had kept his head down since the bikers entered, now stood a little taller behind the counter. His jaw set. The crowd was united not by her command, but by the courage she had given them simply by standing tall. The shift in power was complete. The biker had walked in with the belief that fear could conquer respect. But now he was learning the truth. Fear crumbles when it stands against dignity. The woman took a step back, not out of retreat but out of confidence. She no longer needed to be directly in his face to make her point. The room itself was with her. She let her eyes sweep across the crowd, meeting the gazes of those who now stood taller, and then she said quietly, You don't have to be afraid anymore. Not of him. Not of anyone like him. The words struck deep. They were not just for the moment. They were for everyone who had ever bowed to fear in this bar or anywhere else. They were for the man who had been afraid to speak up at work, for the woman who had stayed quiet when insulted, for the young man who felt too small to stand against cruelty. Her words reminded them all that fear only held power when silence protected it. The biker's last attempt to cling to dominance was a half-hearted growl. This isn't over, he muttered, but the hollowness in his voice betrayed him. He knew it was over. The woman had not only taken control of the moment, she had stripped him of the weapon he valued most. The night had turned. The bar was no longer a stage for his threats, but for her strength. The shift in power was undeniable, and though the story was not finished yet, one truth had already been written into the hearts of everyone present. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly, steady and unbroken, until fear has no choice but to retreat. The bar was no longer the same place it had been when the bikers first pushed open the doors. At first it had been a room filled with laughter, then fear, and then silence. But now it was something else entirely. The atmosphere had shifted into a quiet storm, one that did not roar but carried a weight that could not be ignored. Every person inside had felt the spark of change, and though no one had spoken loudly, their hearts were beating to the same rhythm. The tattoo had awakened them. The words of the woman had lifted them, and for the first time the bar began to remember what unity felt like. The biker sensed it too, though he tried to fight against it. He had always been able to bend groups to his will, to turn crowds into background shadows of his dominance. But this was different. He could feel their eyes, steady and unafraid, pressing back against him. It was like standing against a wave that had been building silently all along. He looked to his men for strength, but even they were not standing as firm as before. Their shoulders had slumped, their eyes darted nervously, and none of them carried the same air of invincibility they had when they walked in. The woman stood still, her torn shirt no longer a sign of weakness but a banner of resilience. She did not need to speak loudly anymore. The crowd had taken her words into themselves, and they were already spreading. The first sign of it came from an old man near the pool table. His hair was silver, his back bent slightly with age, but his voice carried clearly when he finally said, "She's right." The room turned toward him. He rose slowly, his hand gripping his cane, and though his body seemed frail, his eyes were bright with fire. "I served in Vietnam," he said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "I've seen what real courage looks like. And I'll tell you this, what that woman just showed us is the same courage I saw in men who would not back down when the world tried to break them." The biker sneered, trying to laugh it off. "Sit down, old man. Nobody wants your war stories," but the old man did not sit down. He took another step forward, standing as tall as his frame would allow. "No," he said firmly. "I won't sit down. Not when you think you can walk in here and make us all bend. Those days are over." The words cracked something open in the crowd. It was as if his voice had given them permission to release the strength they had been holding inside. A younger man, no more than 30, stood next. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a faded tattoo of his own. Not the same as hers, but one that marked his service in the army. "You think you're the toughest man in the room?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying anger that had been kept quiet for too long. "You're not. You're just the loudest, and we're done letting loud men scare us." The biker's jaw clenched. He tried to bark out another order, but before he could, the bartender set down the glass he had been polishing and leaned across the counter. "I've run this place for 20 years, he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen men like you come and go, but I'll tell you what I've never seen, an entire bar standing together. That's what's happening now, and you can't stop it." The ripple of voices grew. A woman near the door raised her hand and said, "You don't scare me anymore." Another added, "We're with her." And soon, the bar was no longer filled with silence, but with a quiet chorus of agreement, people rising one by one, their bodies straight, their eyes no longer lowered. The biker spun in place, his gaze darting from face to face, trying to find the fear he once thrived on. But it was gone. In its place was something unshakable: unity. People who had been strangers just an hour ago were now united by the simple truth that fear had no power when courage stood together. The woman did not gloat, did not raise her voice in triumph. She simply looked around the room, her gaze softening as she saw what her stand had created. She had not come to the bar seeking to be a leader. She had not planned to reveal her tattoo or speak words that would awaken others. But now she stood in the center of a moment that belonged not just to her but to everyone present. She turned back to the biker, her voice low but carrying clearly. "Do you see now? You came in here thinking you could break one person, but what you've done is remind them all of who they are. You cannot scare them anymore, and that means you have nothing left." The biker's men shifted uneasily. One of them, a tall man with long hair and a jacket patched with flames, muttered under his breath, "Maybe we should go." His words were not meant to carry, but in the quiet of the bar they did. The leader snapped his head toward him, eyes blazing. "What did you say?" But the tall man did not back down. He looked at the woman, then at the crowd, then back at his leader. "She's right," he admitted. "This isn't worth it. Look at them, they're not afraid anymore. And if they're not afraid, we don't have control." The admission sent another ripple through the room. The biker's grip on power was breaking not just in the crowd but within his own ranks. His authority was no longer absolute. His men were questioning him, and in that questioning, the last of his dominance began to collapse. The woman took a deep breath, her voice steady as she addressed him one final time. You thought tonight would prove your strength. Instead, it proved their strength. You thought tearing my shirt would shame me. Instead, it revealed something you could never touch. You thought you could silence this bar, but now they're louder than ever, even in their silence. You've lost. The bar seemed to inhale together. Every person standing taller than before, every gaze fixed on the man who had once seemed larger than life. He looked around, and for the first time there was no escape in their eyes. No surrender, no fear, only resolve. The biker's shoulders sagged, his sneer fading into something closer to uncertainty. He tried to laugh again, but it came out hollow. This isn't over, he muttered. But everyone in the room knew it was. The bar stood united, not with fists raised, not with shouting, but with the quiet, immovable strength of people who had remembered what courage felt like. They did not need to fight him. They did not need to chase him out. Their unity had already done what fists never could. It had stripped him of power. And as the night stretched on, that unity remained. A bond forged not out of choice but out of necessity, out of a reminder that when people stand together, even the loudest threat becomes nothing more than noise. The bar had found its strength again, and no biker, no gang, no fear could take it from them. The biker leader stood frozen, his wide frame now looking smaller under the weight of so many eyes pressing into him. Only a short while ago he had walked into the bar convinced he could own it, convinced his presence alone would be enough to bend everyone to his will. For years, intimidation had been his greatest weapon. It had silenced countless rooms, shut down countless voices, and kept people locked in fear. But tonight was different. Tonight, fear had slipped through his fingers like sand, and no matter how hard he tried to clutch it, it was gone. The bar was no longer his. It belonged to the people who stood united in defiance, their backs straight, their gazes steady. He could feel the change in the air, thick and heavy, pressing against him with a strength he could not match. It was not just the woman standing before him who had beaten him. It was the collective courage of everyone in the room. Together, they had stripped him of the power he had carried like a crown. He clenched his fists, trying to summon back the dominance he had lost, but his voice cracked when he shouted, "You think you've won? You think standing together makes you stronger than me?" The words rang out, but no one flinched. No one lowered their head. His voice sounded smaller than it ever had, swallowed by the silence of people who were no longer afraid. One of his men shifted beside him, the tall biker with the patched jacket, who had already hinted at leaving. He spoke again, his voice louder this time, unshaken. "We should go." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of betrayal to the leader. His authority was crumbling, not just in front of the crowd, but within his own ranks. The leader turned sharply, glaring at him with fire in his eyes. "You dare turn on me?" he growled. But the tall man did not waver. He simply looked around the room, then back at the leader. "Look at them," he said plainly. "This isn't our fight anymore. We're not in control. Staying here makes us look like fools." Another biker nodded, shifting his weight uneasily. A third avoided the leader's eyes altogether, his silence louder than words. The gang that had always mirrored his arrogance was breaking apart in front of him, undone not by fists or violence, but by the quiet resolve of a woman and a bar full of people who had rediscovered their strength. The woman remained calm, watching it unfold without gloating, without mocking. She had never needed to shout. Her power came from something deeper, and the entire bar could feel it. She stood as a reminder of what true courage looked like, and that reminder was enough to unravel a man who had built his life on fear. The leader's sneer faltered. He looked at the woman again, his gaze darting to the Marine Corps tattoo that had started it all. He wanted to tear his eyes away, but he could not. That emblem haunted him now. It spoke of battles he had never fought, of discipline he had never known, of a strength he could never claim. It reminded him that his kind of power was hollow, fragile and fleeting. He tried one last time, his voice lower now, desperate. "You'll regret this," he muttered. But even as he said it, he knew the words held no weight. They were the empty echoes of a man who had already lost. The woman answered with calm finality. "I regret nothing, and neither do they." She gestured to the room, and every face reflected the truth of her words. They did not regret standing. They did not regret breaking their silence. For once they were proud of themselves, proud to have chosen dignity over fear. The biker's chest tightened. He looked around, searching for someone, anyone who would show him the submission he was used to seeing. But all he found were eyes filled with quiet defiance. The bar was united. He had no hold here anymore. Finally, his shoulders slumped, his fists unclenched. He spat on the floor, a hollow attempt to leave with some shred of pride, then jerked his head toward the door. "Let's go," he barked to his men. But even his command lacked authority now. It sounded less like an order and more like a plea to escape. One by one, his gang obeyed, but not with the same swagger they had entered with. Their steps were heavy, their eyes low, stripped of the bravado that had once carried them. They moved toward the door in silence, and the silence of the bar followed them. It was not fear this time. It was victory. The leader lingered a moment longer, as if trying to find the courage to reclaim what he had lost. But there was nothing left for him here. The tattoo on the woman's shoulder burned in his mind, and the united strength of the crowd pressed against him like an immovable wall. With a final snarl, he turned and stormed toward the door, pushing it open with more force than necessary. The night air rushed in, cool and cleansing, and then he was gone. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a moment the bar was completely still. The tension that had gripped the room for so long hung there, fragile, as if everyone was waiting to be sure it was really over. Then slowly the air seemed to release, and the room breathed as one. The bartender was the first to speak, his voice rough but steady. "They're gone," he said quietly, as though confirming it for himself as much as for the others. The old man with the cane gave a small nod, his eyes bright. "Gone," he repeated, but his tone carried pride. The younger man with the army tattoo rolled his sleeve back down and exhaled deeply, his chest rising with relief. "Not just gone," he said, "beaten. Not by fists, not by shouting, but by us." The bar murmured in agreement, voices low but steady. People looked at each other with a kind of recognition. The recognition of strangers who had just lived through something together that would bond them for years to come. The woman stood quietly in the center, her eyes sweeping across the room. She did not smile, though there was warmth in her expression. She simply let the moment sink in, knowing it was not about her alone. It was about all of them. She finally spoke, her voice soft but carrying enough for everyone to hear. "You see, fear only wins when you let it. Tonight you did not let it. Remember this. Carry it with you. Because it is not about me or this tattoo. It is about knowing that you are stronger than fear when you stand together." The room felt her words settle deep inside, each person tucking them away as something to hold on to long after the night was over. They had seen it with their own eyes, fear retreating in the face of courage, intimidation crumbling before unity. It was a lesson they would not forget. The biker and his men had left the building, but their departure was not the true ending. The true ending was the strength that now remained, the bond forged in silence and defiance. The retreat of one man had given birth to the awakening of many, and that awakening would echo long after the sound of his boots faded into the night. The bar, once just a roadside stop, had become the setting of a story no one inside would ever forget, a story of fear broken, of voices rising, and of dignity standing taller than intimidation. The retreat had been his, but the victory belonged to them all. The bar was quiet again, but this time it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of reflection, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they have just witnessed something that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. The air no longer carried the weight of intimidation. It carried relief, pride, and the strange calm that comes when courage has been tested and found unbroken. The bikers were gone, their boots no longer echoing on the wooden floor, their swagger dissolved into the night. What remained was the echo of unity, stronger than any voice of fear. People looked at each other with new eyes. Strangers who had come in with their own lives and troubles now shared something that bound them together. A man who had once been too shy to speak in public nodded confidently to the old veteran with the cane. A woman who had spent the night quietly in the corner now smiled with the bartender, knowing they had both stood a little taller than they thought they could. There was no cheering, no wild celebration. Instead, there was something more powerful, a deep, collective understanding that something important had just taken place. The woman at the center of it all did not try to claim the moment as hers. She simply stood still, her torn shirt adjusted but the Marine Corps tattoo still visible on her shoulder. She did not cover it. She did not need to. That emblem had already spoken louder than any words. Yet now she chose to add to it. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the night. Tonight was never about a fight, she began. The bar hushed immediately, everyone leaning in to hear her words. It was about fear. He came here to spread fear. He thought he could tear me down, but he forgot something important. Fear only works if we let it. When you stop giving it power, it disappears. That is what happened here tonight. You stood together, and fear retreated. The bartender nodded slowly, his hands resting on the counter. We never stood like that before, he admitted. Not once in all these years. We always kept our heads down, but you reminded us we didn't have to. The old veteran tapped his cane against the floor, his voice rough with emotion. What she reminded us, he said, is that courage isn't about being fearless. Courage is about standing when you are afraid, about refusing to bend even when it would be easier to stay quiet. That's what I saw tonight. That's what all of us will carry with us, the younger man with the army tattoo added. And it wasn't just her courage. It was what she gave us. We stood because she stood. That's what leadership is. Not shouting, not demanding, just showing what's possible so others remember they can do it too. The woman listened quietly, then said, "It doesn't take a tattoo to stand tall. It doesn't take a uniform. It takes a choice. All of you made that choice tonight. Remember it. The next time someone tries to control you with fear, remember this moment. Remember that when you stand together, you are stronger than anyone who tries to divide you." The words struck deep. They were not just about the bar, not just about the bikers. They were about life beyond those walls. Every person knew it. They thought of moments in their own lives when they had stayed quiet in the face of unfairness, when they had allowed intimidation to silence them, when they had felt powerless. Now they knew they were not powerless. They had seen what unity could do. They had felt the shift when silence turned into defiance, when fear turned into strength. A woman near the door, who had said almost nothing the entire night, finally spoke up. "I've lived in this town my whole life. People like him have come through here before. I always thought it was easier to just stay quiet, to not make trouble. But tonight I saw what happens when we stop staying quiet. I'll never forget that." Her words brought nods all around the room. It was as though the lesson was unfolding in layers, each person recognizing it in their own way. For some, it was about standing up to bullies. For others, it was about rediscovering their voice. For many, it was about the power of standing together instead of facing fear alone. The bartender reached for a fresh glass and held it up, his voice carrying warmth. "Here's to courage," he said simply. "To remembering we don't have to bow." Others raised their glasses, some with drinks still half full, some with empty ones, but it didn't matter. The act was symbolic, a gesture of respect for the woman and for what they had all found inside themselves. The woman did not raise a glass. She simply placed her hand over the tattoo on her shoulder, the ink that had sparked the turning point of the night, and said quietly, "Here's to always being faithful, to yourself, to each other, to what is right." The motto carried weight, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. It was more than words carved into tradition. It was a principle, a way of living that extended beyond the battlefield. And now it belonged not just to Marines, but to everyone in that bar who had chosen to stand faithful to themselves and to each other. Time passed, and the night slowly returned to a gentler rhythm. The jukebox hummed again, playing a softer song, though it sounded different now, less like background noise and more like a hymn of resilience. People returned to their seats, but they did not return to who they had been before. Something had changed. A weight had lifted. A lesson had been learned. When the woman finally prepared to leave, the bar quieted again. People turned to her, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The old veteran saluted her softly, his hand trembling but steady enough to show his respect. The younger man placed his hand over his chest, nodding deeply. The bartender simply said, "Thank you," and the simplicity of the words carried more weight than any speech could. She gave them a small nod in return. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "Just remember tonight. That will be enough." As she walked toward the door, the light from the street outside framed her figure. Her steps were steady, her head held high. She did not look back, not because she did not care, but because she knew she had left them with something far more important than her presence. She had left them with the knowledge that they were stronger than fear, that unity could break intimidation, and that courage, once awakened, could never truly fade. When the door closed behind her, the bar did not fall back into its old ways. Conversations resumed, laughter returned, but underneath it all was a new current, a new foundation built on what they had lived through together. They would tell the story in their own ways, how a biker tore a shirt, how a tattoo froze a bar, how a woman stood tall, and how a crowd stood with her. But no matter how it was told, the lesson would remain the same. The lesson was that true strength is not found in loud threats or in fear. True strength is found in resilience, in dignity, and in the unity of people who refuse to be broken. It was a lesson they would carry into their lives, into their families, into their work, into every quiet moment when they might once have chosen silence. And it was a lesson that would outlive the night itself. For long after the bikers were forgotten, long after the details blurred, the people of that bar would remember the moment when fear retreated and courage stood tall. They would remember the woman who reminded them of their own strength. And they would remember that when unity rises, no intimidation can stand against it. That was the true ending of the night. Not the retreat of the bikers, not the torn fabric of a shirt, but the awakening of courage in ordinary people. That was the lesson. The kind of lesson that lives not in stories alone, but in the hearts of those who experienced it. And from that night on, courage would never be silent again.